So anyway, I want to welcome. It's nice to see a full house here. I am not Tom Beckerman. Tom is escorting a group of students today to Chattanooga, so he left us behind. So but that's okay. All right. And you're gonna go, okay. Oh boy. And I'm not very patient. Okay. So we're going to call the meeting to order. Hopefully everybody looked at the eclipse and saw the minutes from the last meeting. Anybody have any omissions, deletions, edits that need to be done? No? So we'll let them stand then as written. Is Keith here tonight? I don't see him online either. So I know we have a few new members because I'm the treasurer, so I get the PayPal note when they come in. Do we have any new members here tonight?
Yes.
Yay! So see me at the end of the show in the back because we've got some solar glasses for you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Got the solar glass.
Yes, that's a perk of membership this year. You get 2 frees, and then you can buy as many as you want at $1 a piece. Although I will warn you, I had an ask for a huge amount from a school district today, so I'm going to check all of ours out. Yeah. Yay. Okay, good. We bought 10,000, which I know people thought was nuts. Okay, that's actually over on
All right.
that side right there.
Yeah.
But the school, Putnam Schools has 11,500 kids. So I don't. They can share. I mean, to be really honest, if I were, I mean, nobody is going to watch a partial eclipse from start to finish, right? Not if you're, 8 years old. Not even if you're not 8 years old, because you check back every so often, so they could share. But I'm actually going to try to get them as many as they want to get. But that's a different story. Whee!
Now we lost the video.
Oh gosh, hang on.
Just gotta start pulling cables. Coming over you.
There we go.
We can make this work.
We can do it better, faster. Anybody else remember the $6 million man?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't have the sound effect. Did you get some 12-year-old members? He'll fix it in 9 seconds.
Okay, let's see if we can. That's right.
Hold on a second. Yeah, that should be right.
We're gonna drag this back over here. There we go.
Chuck, can you say something?
I can if you want me to. Hello, Mr. Billy.
Oh, he's there. He's just faint.
Yeah,
Okay.
Hold on. You may have to turn your audio up here. Don't turn all the way up. Okay, try now, Chuck.
Hello, all BSAS.
There we go.
All right.
We're getting there.
Talking to you here from outer Dixon, Tennessee.
There we go. All right. We knew we could do it. All right. So we started all over again here. So let me.
I need to move my presentation over too.
Okay.
So,
Well, there we go. I got thumb drives.
okay.
All right. So back where we were. All right. So I have a treasurer's report. Can you throw me that piece of paper? There we go. Our bank balance is now up to $7,954.01. And technically, there we go. That was fun. Technically, we have 4,574.87 in what we call savings, and that's just a bookkeeping division of the main account. Because every year when we do an auction at the banquet in Christmas time, we designate whatever the silent auction gives as our equipment budget. So we keep track of that separately, but it's all one big pile. And we have had not many expenses. We pay $17.50 for the Zoom account every month, but otherwise we really haven't had too many expenses. PayPal is $38.11 because I had another order come in today. We are selling the glasses online. That will end next weekend because I'm A, going out of town, and B, I wouldn't want to trust the post office with the last week mailing. That would just be not good. So there we go. I also keep track a little bit of our social media, and thank you, Donna. Wave your hand. She's in the back there, but she is now doing our Facebook, and she's doing a so much better job because I am just not that social. I really am not. Twitter is easy, right? I can hit repost that cool science thing and that's easy. So I do that. But anyway, in the last 2 weeks, I've had 2 schools that took care of 900 pairs of glasses. And like I said, I got an ask late this afternoon from Putnam County. So I'm going to get back to them after I make a few calls around and see how many pairs I can round up that are laying on the cutting room floors of the various manufacturers. But that's really cool because and this is always the case, people get right up to the eclipse and then, oh my gosh, we need glasses. And there has never been an eclipse where too many glasses were made. That doesn't happen, so they get short toward the end.
And the emergency is number 14 welder glass.
14 welder glass. It makes the sun green, which is kind of fun. And there are lots of cool, the nice thing about having a partial is you can play around with lots of cool things you can do. If you just take your fingers and make a lattice, you will put little tiny eclipse suns all over the ground. Hopefully we have some tree leaves in 2 weeks. The leaves, space between the leaves, will put little cute eclipsed suns all over the ground. And I actually am making a couple for schools. Pinhole viewers stink, okay? Everybody likes them because it's art. Kids can do art. But you get this tiny, if you do the cereal box, you get this like, I don't know, half a centimeter maybe, depending on how big your pinhole is. It's not big. It's not impressive. The longer your box, you can get a bigger sun. But you can also, the first cheap thing you can do is you can buy a pair of 1X readers at the dollar store, and you can use one lens, so you can make 2 of these with just one, if they still have them for $1. Put that over the pinhole instead, and you'll get a bigger sun. But there's a set of lenses that Surplus Shed is selling for $5. It's a lens at the front and a little Barlow that goes in the middle, again, of a box about yay long. And now you can get a sun this big. And then you can see sunspots and other cool things. So anyway, there's just lots of cool ways to look at a partial eclipse and to look at the sun all the time, even when it's not doing the eclipse thing. And so my goal is always to get teachers comfortable with the idea that, yes, you can observe the sun without burning your eyes out. You really can. All right, so I guess, let's see. Tom did actually throw some members in that he thinks that, let's see, on this month, as of this month, we have 181 members. That's pretty awesome. That's pretty close, if not the all-time record. So yeah, it's good to see folks here, and I'm glad that we're getting some. Eclipses are good for astronomy clubs too. All right, so that's it. We have some loaner equipment. That's another perk of being a member is that we have a couple of things you can try before you buy. You can look at them, see how they work. In particular, we have a couple of from smaller to slightly larger Dobbs that are pretty nice. We have a few what I'd call classic old school 4-inch starter scopes because people donate those to the club, and a few other things. So there's a list online on the Google group. So if you're a new member, Keith will, and if he doesn't in the next week or so, poke him at membership@bsasnashville.com, and he will send you an invite to the Google group, which is just a private group that people can chat amongst themselves, talk about what's going on, share pictures, and that's where the list of loaner equipment is. All right. Yes. Ooh, the hard thing is we don't have a permanent storage facility. And so I would say it depends.
I might be able to take some.
He can take some. So
I'll get you later.
yeah. I mean, I've got a bunch in my basement and garage. They're around, but That's the hardest part is just finding a place to stash them and keep track of them. Maintenance a little bit, yeah. And typically what we get donated, although sometimes these are fun projects, is this has been in the closet for 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. So they're older, which is still okay. And yeah, some of them I would say donate to schools, except that that's a disaster area. They go into a closet at the school and they never come out. Or they come out in pieces, which I've had people bring when I was at the planetarium. They'd bring us the pieces and say, does this still work? So, but, you know, there are probably some scout groups and camps that could, and even some of the state parks. Once upon a time, somebody gave every state park a Meade telescope, and nobody knows where they are today. But if we had, you know, constant donations, maybe they would always have a telescope. So anyway, I will say Shelby Bottoms has a really nice one, and they do know how to use it. All right. And as always, as a member, you're always welcome to ask for help. How does this thing, I have a telescope. I don't know exactly how to use it. It's frustrating me this way. Bring it to a star party and set up next to it somebody else, and that you'll get a lot of help that way. Typically we of course, January it went and snowed on us, but we try to have at least one workshop a year where we invite people, hey, bring your stuff to the meeting and we'll set it up. So people are full of lots of good advice, and take advantage of that, because everybody here has been a beginner at some point. All right. So these are our upcoming meetings here. So we have, this is April. No, it's not April yet. So we have April and May here on the third Wednesday. In June, we're going to shift because we have a holiday that happens on the Wednesday. And then we have camp in July, so we're going to shift again. So those 2 months, we're going to move a week later. But we'll note that in the emails. And there's what's going on. We'll be at Warner Park in April. And I need to fill in the rest of that stuff. So I know there's a day coming up that I don't have on here yet. Every year Bell's Bend has an outdoor festival, and we usually have a table. That's a daytime event. But I like to go if it's a sunny day. We'll do some solar observing. That's a fun time.
That's April 13th.
Thank you. So we will be there if it's a nice, you know, day. I'll be a little groggy because I'll be just back from going across the country. But
Does that end before sunset, or does it?
no, it ends about 3:30 in the afternoon. But if it were a beautiful night and we wanted to stay, I think they'd let us hang out. But
Well, we have Warner Park that
Yep.
evening.
that's right. That's true. That's the same day. So we'll be moving across the county. We have a lovely poster that we had made for our 90th anniversary. If anybody's interested, I did bring some of those in today, so I've got that. And there's the solar glasses link as well. Hey, Frank. Oh, well, good. Maybe I'll get a chance to look at the sun tomorrow. I didn't get to today, but Friday looks like a washout. Okay. The clear sky chart is always at the bottom of our webpage, and it's always a handy reference. There are lots of apps that do this. Weirdly enough, they pretty much all use the same models because there are only so many weather models. So clear sky chart uses the Canadian forecast because they're better with clouds. The American forecast, really, we don't care so much about clouds. It's just, is it going to rain or not? But they're not really worried about clouds, but we are. So. And
European model.
European model is fun, but not a lot of people use it because they charge for it. Yeah. Yeah. Whereas the American stuff is shared. You know, we're nice with our stuff. That's, but you know.
Are there any advantages one over the other?
It depends. You know, the Europeans did a really outstanding job of forecasting the track of Superstorm Sandy when it came through New York. And so the next supercomputer they bought, that was the wrap they put on it. just, not to rub it in or anything. So it just depends. People are always changing the models. I think this year, the North American model got changed. Sometime you can have, when Nathan's in town, poke him and he'll tell you what he thinks about the models. The Weather Service is insisting that they're going to get good enough to where they won't need the human forecasters. The human forecasters do not agree. We'll see how that goes. And so there's a cool thing from our Facebook page. Pickett is a beautiful place. When the sun goes down, the Milky Way comes out. So if you want to have some dark skies, that's a great place to go camping. Later on in May, I think, is when they have glowworms, which are super cool. And those tours sell out. They're in there. They call them caves, but they're really rock ledge overhangs. But they glow blue and they look like little stars. And there's our Twitter feed. Some of it anyway. So yeah, radio astronomy is having their light pollution moment, because now they want to do your cell phone up to the Starlinks. Well, that's radio. And it's phones, millions of phones across the landscape, all sending radio signals up and down. They're supposed to leave certain fractions of the spectrum open, but there's bleed over and stuff. And anyway, it's going to cause noise. So it's kind of weird that even in a wavelength we don't see in, you could have light pollution. Instagram. Thank you, Steve. He's our Instagram person. So send us your pictures. And there's the Google group. So that's a nice place to go. Night Sky Network is what we use to keep track of our membership. So you usually will get poked when you register to go there and create an account, because you can keep track of when you last paid. And then we know when, that you're a member, and that's how we easily keep track of it. There's also a lot of cool resources there. So they have activities, they have cool stuff. It's worth checking out. You can watch the shadow go across the earth. Whee! Yep. Mazatlan would not be a bad place to be. So we got that. So here's our next couple of, let's see, this was passed. So Saturday, March 9, private star party. I do not remember what the weather was like. Did anybody go? Did anybody remember what the weather was like that weekend? We've had some lousy new moon weekends. Bell's Bend was very, very nice.
Yeah, kind of stripy, but pretty good.
Yeah, toward the end it finally clouded over and didn't go away, but most of the night was okay. All right, so the Middle Tennessee Science and Engineering Fair. I don't know if they still need judges. I should look at that and make sure we do, as a club, give an award for astronomy related projects if they're any good. And so somebody from the club will go and check out the projects just to see if there are any that are astronomy related. Some years there aren't any. And some years there's a couple. So it's always fun to go. And if you've never been to a science fair, it's a lot of fun to see what the kids do. It really is. And to ask them about their project and have them explain it to you in their own words. Yeah. We had a young lady come the year of the eclipse. She did an experiment with chickens. Chickens.
Okay.
She raised them, and so she observed their behavior during the eclipse. And she had a control group, a friend that had chickens that were not in totality. It was an excellent project, and it wasn't something, a lot of them are just out of the book, the big book of science fair projects. So it was really nice to see a unique project. I've seen a young man try to make a helicopter to fly on Mars. Who would think, right?
Did the chickens fall asleep?
No, but they definitely did change their behavior. And she had descriptive categories for every different thing that chickens do. But so that's fun. All right. Take two maybe of the Messier Marathon for those who are in town, April 5 to 6 at Ron Ladd's house. Thank you, Ron Ladd. You don't see him online, but it's really close to the Water Valley Overlook, but he's got a bathroom and a place to warm up and electricity. So those are really huge. A Messier Marathon is where you attempt to observe as many Messier objects as you can in one night. And in the spring, the way the sky is, they're not distributed evenly all the way around the sky. And in the spring, you can, and people have, looked at all 110 in one night. Now that would be, we really can't do that well. And I'm not going to talk about whether it's cheating or not to use your go-to telescope. But it's fun. And to do something like that, you will know your gear much better by the end of the night. And you'll have a lot of fun. Can I tease this faint fuzzy out? All right. Did I get through all that? Total solar eclipse, how many people are going to be out of town?
For the eclipse.
Yeah,
I am.
there we go. So that's a goodly number of folks. So,
I'm going Texas,
yep.
Comfort, Texas.
And then we come back.
Nearest place with totality from that.
I think Paducah is pretty close. And it's just inside the line. Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking the Ohio River looks like I checked Cahokia because Stephen was talking about it.
Yeah.
That's
It's not in.
98.5.
Yeah. So it runs, yeah, kind of just skirts along the Ohio River and up is where the edge is. And then we come back to the public star party, and then we'll be back here in mid-April. So there's the MTSEF. And yeah, we give awards. We typically give $100, I think, for the first prize, $50 for a second prize if we have two projects. And they get a year membership. If we're lucky, we get them to come and present because that's just cool. All right, so that's the Messier Marathon weekends. Fun things coming up. So a couple of good things to look for. Yeah, Mercury. Mercury is a challenge. I mean, I can count, I think, still on the fingers of maybe two hands now. Maybe I'm up to two hands of how many times I've actually seen Mercury. It's not easy to spot in the sky because it's always low in the sunrise or sunset. And unless you're really dedicated getting up at sunrise, we don't do that much. So challenge to see the penumbral eclipse. That penumbra is just not that dark. And because your eyes continuously adjust, it doesn't really, it's hard to see visually. Your camera would have no problem, but visually it's not much of a thing. All right. That's a nice graphic. Look at that. Yeah. Most of the Nashville area is 95%. And that's not bad, but that's not totality. And honestly, if no one told you it was happening, you wouldn't know. You would think, you'd go outside and go, you know, it looks funny because the light level will drop to that of about an overcast day. But again, it's going to do that over time. So your eye, if you just, if it did it instantly, you'd notice it. But over time, your eyes adjust and you really honestly wouldn't. And there's just going to be this stupid little crescent of sun. So it is well worth looking at. I know, everybody can encourage people to go to the path. Let's make the biggest traffic jam we possibly ever can. And there are more people this time. There are more than twice the number of people living in the path as there were in 2017. I'm not sure April will be as forgiving with the weather as August was, but we'll find out. So there's another picture with us in the picture. Get your glasses. And I have seen quite a few around. Kroger has had them, Walmart has them. So a number of stores are selling them.
Theo, this is Chuck.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if y'all had seen the video I sent of the total solar eclipse that happened in a cloudy area.
Oh, yeah.
So you go from an overcast sky to nighttime kind of darkness pretty
Dark.
quick. So I'm thinking, even if I'm going to get into Arkansas or maybe out past Paducah that way,
Yeah.
even if it's overcast, that looked like something that'd be really worth seeing in totality.
Yeah.
Just
It'll still
everything
be
go
cool.
really, really dark.
Yep. 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 I would agree with that. It's still going to be pretty weird and fun. So, all right. And the next meeting, everybody can bring their stories and pictures, right? So that's good fun. All right. Is there anything else anybody needs to holler at, comment on? All right. With that, we are going to turn the floor over to the gentleman in the back. And Billy, is this a PowerPoint? Cool. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing this, I think, so that I can, let's find my cursor. I'm going to stop sharing this so that I can bounce out of the PowerPoint and escape. I'm actually going to drag, hang on a second, I'm going to drag this Zoom meeting. Look out. Back over to here. All right. Then we're going to turn this guy, close that, and I'm not that good at mice when they cross two screens. What we're going to do that in File, Open, From, Browsing. You guys can all laugh at this, right? This is my ancient Windows 7. This one?
That one right there.
There we go. Yep. And let's see, slideshow from beginning. All right. I think you can just click through this.
And do we need to share screen?
Yes, we do. So let me, that's where I need to minimize or make this one smaller. I can see the Zoom meeting behind. Share. PowerPoint. This one, share. All right. Chuck, are you seeing Edward Emerson Barnard up there?
I am young and old, it
Yay.
appears.
All right. I have to carefully get out from between all these. Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. Anybody up here for the first time tonight? Got a few people. All right. So hopefully you've had some time to look around. And if you haven't been upstairs to see the big telescope after the talk, I'd be happy to take everyone up there who's interested in checking it out. Okay. And I'm going to try to limit my talk to about 45 minutes, but hopefully we won't go over that much if we do go over it. But anyway, so I started researching Edward Emerson Barnard a few years ago when I was doing an Osher lifelong learning class, and there's a really great bio of Barnard called The Immortal Fire Within. I've got a copy up here if anybody wants to flip through it tonight, but it's a really great bio. Details his time here in Nashville, out in California, when he goes to Chicago to the Yerkes Observatory, and all of that. So it's really incredible what he was able to do in his life, especially as we see how he started out with basically nothing. So let's jump right in here. So in the beginning, Barnard was born right here in Nashville in 1857, December 16th. Sorry for the smaller font for folks in back there, but he was born into an impoverished family, the son of Reuben and Elizabeth Barnard, and he started in hardship from the very beginning. I mean, his father passed before he was born. His mother had health issues that prevented her from being able to go into work and provide for the family. He also had an older brother, Charles. There's very little known about him, but it's thought that he might have also suffered from health issues. So it was really up to Edward from the very beginning to support his family. And despite the fact that public schooling in Nashville was free at the time that Barnard was a young boy, he only got to go to school for 2 months. He did learn to read and write from his mother. So she taught him a lot of what he knew, but he really didn't have that formal education. And that's something that would really be in the back of his mind quite a bit until a little bit later on in life. But for Barnard, astronomy began very early. So he was born in 1857, and he could recall seeing a very, very bright comet in the night sky when he was very young. And it's thought that this might be the Great Comet of 1861. He also had remarked that the stars really helped to soothe the sadness of his childhood. He was impoverished. The Civil War was occurring when he was very young. He could literally hear the booming of the cannons in the cities around. When he was around the age of 9, he almost died of cholera. So not too fun of a time for Barnard, but he loved the night sky, and he would often lie in the back of a wagon and just stare up at the sky, not knowing what any of the names were of the stars or what the constellations were, or that some of those were even planets. Okay, but he always loved the night sky, and until his death many years later. When he was around the age of 9, his mother got him a job at a portrait studio in downtown Nashville that was owned by John Van Stavoren. Stavoren had put out an ad requesting just young helpers to do errands and little things around the studio. And Barnard's mother was able to get him this job. One of those particular duties that Barnard would do was run something called the Jupiter camera, which was this large contraption that was used to direct sunlight down into the portrait studio. You can see on the side of it there are a bunch of cranks and whatnot, and you would basically turn those so that the camera would follow the sun. And if you weren't careful, like if you fell asleep, like many young kids did that were hired to do this, then sunlight, instead of being streamed down into the studio, would start streaming onto the inside of the camera, which was wooden, which would catch fire very nicely. So it did catch on fire a couple of times, but Barnard's mother, Elizabeth, said, if you hire my son, he is a very, very diligent person. He will not fall asleep. He will make sure that it's done right. And that's the way he did basically everything in his life. So he was there for well over a decade. But, even then, he was a very astute observer, a very good observer of just the things going on around him. As he's directing this Jupiter camera over, periods of hours throughout the year, he was noticing that the positions of the shadows were changing on the building whenever, for example, the 12 o'clock bell rung in one of the local churches. He noticed that the shadows were getting longer in certain parts of the year and shorter in other parts of the year, but they were also shifting positions left and right. And so he had actually on his own discovered something called the equation of time. So in this view here, if you were to take a picture of the sun at the same time, maybe once a week, and have the camera positioned in the exact same position, ignored daylight savings time, just took a picture of the sun, you did this once a week throughout the year, overlaid all those images, you would get this really nice figure of 8 that we call the analemma. The technical term is the equation of time, but you'll often see this figure on sundials because you can use that to then figure out how many minutes to add or subtract to your sundial to accurately tell what we call the mean solar time, what our clocks are telling. And we talk more about that later on if you're interested there. 1869. So Barnard is a little over 10 years old. He observes his first partial solar eclipse, which I'm not going to try to get the mouse on that screen there, but that really big band coming down just above Tennessee, that was the path of that particular eclipse. Very similar in proximity, that path of totality is very similar in proximity to this upcoming eclipse. So it was a very significant partial eclipse. And in fact, the sun was pretty well obscured at sunset. So Barnard actually was able to get a little bit of a view of that and really kind of caught his attention and really helped to focus his attention on the sky. I know there's a lot of text on here, but there's a little point that I want to get to. Around the age of 19, this is where Barnard has a big breakthrough in terms of astronomy. There was a childhood acquaintance that whenever this guy showed up, Barnard knew, okay, he's going to want to borrow money. And Barnard was a very kind and generous person whenever he could be. And he would often let him borrow money, which he knew that borrow meant he was never going to see it again. But when he was around 19, this person approached him and said, hey, I need to borrow some money, but as kind of collateral, here are some books that I can give you in return. Barnard figured they were probably stolen. He said, you know what, this is the last time I'm going to give you money, but here's some. I don't want to see you again. He took the books, kind of threw them aside, but later on, he started looking through them. And one of them was a book that had a portion of it written by the Reverend Thomas Dick, who was a noted astronomy writer. And in it were maps of the night sky, information about the stars, the planets. So Barnard was now able, he now had his first resource where he could start looking at the night sky and be able to figure out, oh, that bright thing up there, that bright star, that's the star Vega. He was able to start to identify the constellations. So this was a huge turning point in his life. Okay. James Braid, who is pictured on the right there, he's sitting underneath of the Jupiter camera. Stavoren is, or Van Stavoren is on the left side there. Braid was the chief instrument maker of the photograph gallery. And he had acquired some lenses over the years. And when Barnard really showed that really strong interest in astronomy, he started developing these small telescopes, these pretty much very crude telescopes for Barnard to be able to use. But with those, he got his first up-close views of the moon, Jupiter, including 3 of its moons. And he even saw Venus when it was in a crescent phase. And later on, after Barnard had made all these other discoveries, including the 5th moon of Jupiter that would make him world famous, he still said that first view of Venus, seeing the horns of Venus, that crescent of Venus, made more of a profound impact on him than that discovery of that new moon. So, and this was just with a very small telescope. The second one was only 2¼ inches in aperture. But that really lit a fire under him. And he spent 2/3 of his annual salary one year to purchase a 5-inch refractor. Here's a sketch of him with it in 1877. He referred to it lovingly as his pet. He loved this telescope. This is the one where he would really start making discoveries. And it was really only outdone locally by Vanderbilt University's 6-inch refractor, which if you haven't seen that telescope and you're here tonight, you can walk down to the residence and see it in the big window. That's the telescope Barnard and even Seyfert used in part of his career. But this is where Edward starts going out night after night from the time that it got dark enough to start observing to basically daybreak, just observing as long as he could and seeing things for the first time. He independently on his own discovered the Great Red Spot, which we knew had existed, but the Great Red Spot of Jupiter. But it was the first time Barnard had observed it, and when it finally rotated into view, it was just really, he was gobsmacked by it. But for him, it was brand new, so this really ignited more of that interest in observing as much as he could. He would take his telescope to the roof of the photograph studio and hold little star parties welcoming people to come up and observe. And he became a very well-known name in Nashville even at that time. There was a story where he came into work one morning and he had a wound on the side of his nose. And when one of his colleagues asked what happened, he said, well, I was at the telescope and it was a cold night. I had been observing for so long. I didn't realize that the telescope had literally frozen to the side of my nose. And when I pulled my head away, it actually ripped the skin. So that's kind of how focused he got when he was observing. And, this wasn't just a one-time thing. Well, I mean, the frostbite might have been, but every night, he's diligently observing like that. And that's a recurring theme for him. But he often remarked that observing was often, very lonely. It's very quiet out there. And there's a really kind of a fun little story that he told. Let me read it here because it's about a paragraph long. But anyway, he was observing Jupiter one evening. It was about 2 a.m. And he paused to rest his eyes for a moment. And then he looked over and was, quote, horrified to see two glaring greenish red balls of fire a few feet away in the obscurity of the bushes. And as he said, cold chills played up and down my backbone, and I was too frightened to move. And these balls of fire came slowly toward me. A supernatural horror seemed to bind me to that spot as a nightmare holds one in its pitiless grasp. I could not have moved if I'd known the foul fiend himself that was behind those lights. Just at the point when I felt that I must collapse as the hateful lights came close to me, I felt the warm touch of the tongue of some animal licking my cold hand. In the obscurity, I saw a great dog wagging its tail in a friendly manner. The relief was tremendous, and a warm flow of blood seemed to infuse my veins. It proved to be the great and fierce bulldog belonging to my neighbor. The dog had always looked so savage with his cruel teeth that I had not attempted to cultivate a friendship. Why he had not attacked me in the darkness and what made him seek this friendship, I do not know. But from that time on, he was my good friend and made a habit to lie down near me every night while I was observing. His friendship was a blessing. I know I'm getting a little choked up reading that too. His friendship was a blessing, for I no longer felt the nameless dread of the night with this powerful form at my feet. And the author goes on to remark that it may be then that we owe more than we know to this friendly bulldog for the astronomical achievements of Edward Barnard. So kind of a fun little story there. Anyway, so Barnard, he's observing as much as he can. He figures out, I really want to be an astronomer. What do I need to do that? In 1877, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, met in Nashville, and the president of the AAAS was Simon Newcomb, who was a noted mathematician. He really wasn't an observer. He was more on the numbers side of astronomy. But Barnard was very eager to meet with him to say, I've got a telescope. I'm making all of these observations. What do I need to do to become an astronomer? Unfortunately, the meeting didn't go as planned because Newcomb basically said, you know what, you really don't have any educational background. And to be an astronomer, you've got to have that education. You've got to have the physics, the math. So I would suggest that you put aside your telescope and work on your education, which that was a huge blow for Barnard. He supposedly went offsite and just started crying. He was so disappointed. But he decided instead to make a compromise. On clear nights, he would be out with the telescope. On cloudy or rainy nights, he would be with the books. So he's getting a little bit of both, which would pay off. But he did start making other observations that were contributing to a body of knowledge of science. In 1878, there was a transit of Mercury. You can barely make out that little spot just above the center of the sun. But he worked with some of the faculty of Vanderbilt to do timings of when Mercury first appeared on the sun and when it was leaving the sun. So those timings were recorded in an official government report. Let's see here. He eventually moved to this house on 1919 Patterson Avenue. And he made his first comet discovery from its yard in 1881 using his own telescope. He also made some observations of Jupiter and its great red spot, and even made very detailed sketches of what he was observing and sent those into a publication known as the English Mechanic. And the editor actually remarked that they were some of the very best sketches that he had ever seen. Here's a little sampling of that just to kind of show you what Barnard was able to tease out of the image from that 5-inch telescope. You can see some of the dark shadows of the moons passing in front. You can even see some of the moons themselves. But Barnard was very meticulous in his observations, very careful when he made recordings. And he was also very averse to drawing rash conclusions. He wanted to make sure he had all the facts before he started trying to draw any sort of a conclusion. 1877 was a big year for Martian observations. That's when Asaph Hall at the Naval Observatory discovered the 2 moons of Mars. And once it was determined that, or once their orbits were determined, Barnard was actually started working on a little monograph called Mars, His Moon, and His Heavens. And it was basically describing Mars as seen from Phobos, and also how one standing on Mars would actually observe Phobos and even Deimos crossing the sky. And it turns out it was a very, very accurate monograph, but he sort of got sidetracked on that and never published it. He was hoping it would be a serial, but never finished it. But anyway, he also noted that in his observations of Mars, sometimes there were these great clouds that obscured the surface features of the planet, which we now know those clouds were in fact global dust storms that are the bane of our observations of the planet. In 1881, he married Rhoda Calvert. She was the sister of 2 gentlemen that joined the photograph gallery, which had been sold to Rodney Poole. But Peter and Ebenezer Calvert would be 2 of Barnard's close colleagues. And when their sister moved into town and was introduced to Barnard, they were basically smitten with one another and married in 1881. She was, I think, about 13 years his senior, but I mean, she would end up, you know, it was a match made in heaven. She would be his best friend, you know, until she died. He also became good friends with Lewis Swift. Swift as in Swift-Tuttle, the progenitor of the Perseid meteor shower. Swift would end up being a mentor for Barnard, because Barnard didn't have a father figure in his life, and he often looked towards these older gentlemen as sort of these father figures to kind of help guide him. But he would be a great friend and help Barnard when he was trying to announce discoveries and you know, really get his name imprinted in astronomy. He started discovering comets in 1881. The first comet, he was able to see it one night, but he was not able to recover it. And when he reported his discovery, others said that they could not find the supposed comet near the star Alpha Pegasi. And some even said that it was probably just a reflection in the lens. Well, Barnard, being a very, very diligent observer and knowing his telescope and knowing what reflections looked like, was, you know, fuming at this idea, because he would not just, you know, he would make sure that what he was seeing was actually there before he announced it. So that was kind of a sore spot for him. But it would just be a few months before he would discover his first official comet on September 17th, 1881. Lewis Swift had correspondence with an entrepreneur out of New York, H.H. Warner. And Warner had actually funded an observatory in Rochester. And Swift encouraged him to set up this new prize called the Warner Prize that would award $200 to anybody who would discover a new comet or be the first person to recover a comet coming back into the solar system. And Barnard got his first prize in 1881. And that would actually start the funding to purchase a lot and build a small house, seen here. And he called that Comet House, because in total, there would be 5 Warner Prizes he would get that would actually help pay for this house and the lot. So in the background there, that building just to the left of the porch, that is Kirkland Hall on the Vanderbilt campus, back when it had the 2 towers. There was a fire, I think, in 1905 that destroyed one of the towers. So now it has that one iconic tower. On the porch there also standing is his wife Rhoda, and then sitting just to the right of her is his mother Elizabeth. Comets were a huge deal for Barnard. He meticulously scanned the sky. He was kind of like the modern day Charles Messier, trying to find these objects. And he would end up discovering quite a few in his lifetime. In 1882, in September, he was able to first observe the Great Comet of 1882. Observed it for weeks, and on October 4th, that's when he started noticing that there was something going on with this comet. The head, instead of being a very bright nucleus, was now starting to elongate. And eventually he saw that it separated into 3 distinct pieces. He kept observing that for a few weeks, and on October 14th, he had set an alarm to awaken himself to where he could go out and observe this comet when it finally rose. But that night, he ended up having this really weird dream where he goes outside and he sees a sky just absolutely full of comets. Some had tails, some had no tails, some had stupendously long tails. But just as the dream was starting, as any good dream starts out, you immediately get woken up. So he goes outside, he sets up his telescope, and he starts moving it towards where the comet is. But as he's looking in the eyepiece, he starts noticing these other fuzzy objects. And he scans more and more, and he sees more and more of these objects. And he realized that, in a way, his dream was actually a premonition of what he was going to see, because this comet head had actually broken up into a number of pieces. There were 6 large pieces that they tracked for a couple of weeks, and it was such a splendor that he even risked waking his wife to come out and take a look at it, but she got to see it as well. So comets are going to be a big deal for Barnard. He helped with observing the December 6th, 1882 transit of Venus. Here's a more modern view showing how Venus's atmosphere will refract sunlight. He was able to observe some of this as well and make very detailed observations of its position and exactly what he was seeing, and those got published. But by now, Vanderbilt was really starting to take a notice of Barnard. He knew what he was doing despite his lack of formal education and training. Vanderbilt's either the 3rd or 4th building on the main campus was the original observatory seen here. It stood from about 1875 until 1952, and it really was being underutilized. But Bishop McTeer spoke with Chancellor Landon Garland and convinced him that Barnard was really the person to be the first director of this place, because he knew how a telescope works, he knew how to find objects. He could even instruct students, even though, again, he had no formal training. But Chancellor Garland decided to take the risk, and he hired Barnard to be the first director of the observatory. Edward would also be allowed to take some courses while doing this, not a full course load, but he would get some of that formal education he so desperately wanted. And he would also get a $500 annual salary. He accepted that, and he was even allowed to move his wife and his mother from Comet House onto the main campus where the astronomer's residence was. So not too shabby. While he was here in Nashville doing his work at Vanderbilt, he independently rediscovered, so to speak, the Gegenschein. So you've probably heard of zodiacal light, which is the glow of scattered sunlight that you see over in the west at sunset, certain parts of the year, or just over in the east, just before sunrise in other parts of the year. And again, all we're seeing is scattered light, or sunlight scattering off of dust particles that is orbiting around the sun along with the planets. Turns out it looks like a lot of that dust actually comes from Mars, but that had been known for a while, and it's often called the false dawn. But there's this other effect called the Gegenschein, which is it's a German term that means counterglow. And it's called that because it's directly opposite the sun, 180 degrees from the sun. It's fainter, it's harder to see than that zodiacal light, but Barnard was observing one night, and he stepped out of the observatory just to kind of take a break, And he looked up and he saw this faint cloud glowing. And he saw that it very gradually moved across the sky with the stars. And he would end up tracking this for about 40 years and just making detailed observations of where it was and how it behaved. He contacted Lewis Swift and said, hey, I just discovered this thing. And Swift said, well, actually, that's the Gegenschein. We've known about it for a while, but nobody really knows exactly what it is. Some thought it might actually be the glow of hydrogen or helium gas escaping our atmosphere and being blown directly away from the Earth by the sun. Barnard favored the explanation that it might actually be refracted sunlight traveling through our atmosphere and creating a bright point in our atmosphere directly opposite the sun. Kind of like if you have a round base and you put a light source on one side, it will focus light onto the other side. But we now know that this is just where it's still that zodiacal light, but it looks a little bit brighter, like you see in that right side image, because if you imagine these dust grains as little balls, if you're exactly opposite the sun, you're seeing those dust grains and they're full phase. The zodiacal light to the left and right, you're seeing those dust grains in kind of a gibbous phase, so they're not going to appear quite as bright. Okay. So, but anyway, Barnard, his efforts really helped to reinvigorate interest in the Gegenschein. And then it was into the 20th century before we really understood what it was. He would discover about 36 double stars in his career. But the most striking one and his favorite of all was Beta Capricorni. And it was his favorite just because of how he discovered that it was a double. So here are two images of the moon. This is actually showing the moon about to occult or pass in front of the bright star Aldebaran in Taurus. But Beta Capricorni lies very close to the ecliptic, so it will often be occulted by the moon. But Barnard was observing the star as the moon was about to cover it using the 6-inch telescope at Vanderbilt. So he expected that when the moon just touched that star, it would instantly wink out. But instead, he found that that star dimmed dramatically for a split second and then fully disappeared. And he thought about it for a little bit and he realized, oh, this must actually be a double star. And what we saw was the bright star get obscured first, and then a split second later, the moon moved in front of that second star. When he reported this, he had other astronomers take a look at that star, and he even scrutinized it himself and found that, yes, it actually was a very, very tight double. So kind of a fun way to discover that a star was in fact double. 1884, he discovers his first comet with the Vanderbilt telescope. Again, this is the one that's down in the residence. But then there's kind of a temporary end to an era. First of all, his mother dies on December 1st, 1884, which is a big blow to him. So it's a little bit harder to do work when you're depressed. But anyway, he discovers 3 comets in 1885. But by the August of that year, he ended up giving up regular comet hunting, going out every night and searching the sky, because he said it was often a big waste of time. He might go months before discovering a comet. And then sometimes he discovers a comet just to find that somebody actually discovered it a day before. And he was also very upset at the lack of zeal among other astronomers in comet hunting, or in just comets in general, because at this point, we're basically just looking at them and saying, oh yeah, this one's bright, this one's on this kind of orbit, but there wasn't a lot of other science really done at the time. So he focuses his efforts elsewhere, discovers the Rosette Nebula on January 23rd. When he found this, he referenced star charts and found that there was no indication of any nebulosity in this region. Turns out when he mentioned this to Lewis Swift, Swift had also seen this, but thought it's such a big area on the sky, somebody must have seen this before, so he didn't bother reporting it. So the title of discovery actually goes to Barnard. This is one thing that probably everyone has heard of, Barnard's galaxy. He discovered this with his own 5-inch telescope. And when he came across it, he then went to the Vanderbilt telescope, which was polar aligned, to get coordinates. we didn't know what this was at the time, other than maybe a big star cluster. But then about 50 years later, actually about not even 40 years later, Edwin Hubble would scrutinize this object, find variable stars in it, and this would be the first object to be proven to be outside of the realm of the Milky Way, showing that the realm of the Milky Way. So it was outside of our galaxy. So that was the first definitive evidence that our Milky Way was not the entire universe. It was a small island in our universe, and this was another one of them. Then the Andromeda Galaxy was right after that. With the 6-inch Vanderbilt telescope, he discovered the California Nebula. But then comet hunting picks up again. He discovers his next comet, and that kind of helps reinvigorate his interest in searching for these objects. At the time, though, Lick Observatory was being constructed, and Barnard dreamed of being able to go to one of these massive telescopes to be able to utilize much greater light gathering power. He was very limited in his equipment at Vanderbilt University. Vanderbilt's telescope was not much bigger than his own. In fact, when he started discovering all of these comets in Nashville, the city literally tried to build him his own observatory right in his backyard. But he very, very politely declined, because ultimately he wanted to go out of Nashville to one of these large telescopes. And if he accepted that very generous gift, he'd be stuck here in Nashville. So thankfully, he did go out to California. He was contacted by Edward Holden, who would become the director of that observatory. And Holden had mentioned the possibility of a job position to Barnard. And so Barnard kept in close contact and was very eager to take up that position. So one little last thing about Barnard and comets. He discovered 3 more in 1887, and that would bring him up to a total of 9 while he was here in Nashville. In fact, Vanderbilt's first annual publication was named Comet in honor of Barnard. But Edward Holden officially offers Edward Barnard a job at the Lick Observatory to start in October of 1887. Barnard sort of jumped the gun there and announced his resignation a little bit early in July that year, and was set to leave in mid-September of 1887 to get out to California. But the problem was, that was before Edward Holden said, okay, we've got everything set up, we're ready for you to come out here. But you can't blame Barnard. He's very, very eager to get out to this massive telescope. But their journey there was hard, and they had to make sacrifices. And that even meant that Barnard had to sell his beloved pet telescope to pay some of the bills. So when he got to California, he basically surprised Holden. And Holden tried to help him out and ended up getting him a temporary job copying legal papers. But he was eventually allowed to start at the observatory, initially given a job of equipment inventory. One of his colleagues, James Keeler, the namesake of the Keeler Gap, gave him his first view through the 36-inch telescope. And a little bit later on, he was given the go-ahead to move up to the mountain quarters and begin as one of the staff astronomers. But he wouldn't get to use this telescope. He would get to use this telescope. This is a 12-inch refractor. And it was the main instrument that Barnard would use for some time before he finally got use of the 36-inch refractor. One of the problems was that Edward Holden wasn't really an observational astronomer. He was more like Newcomb. He really liked the numbers and the theory behind it. But being the director of the observatory, he had his own time with the 36-inch telescope. And he was a big policy guy. You know, he was a rules follower. He loved organization. And once he set a policy, he did not waver from it at all. And the policy was certain people would get certain nights on the telescopes. And it didn't matter if somebody said, okay, I'm done using the telescope for the night. If anybody else wants it, it was against policy. So he kind of had this draconian view of organization. So there were times where Holden would be done using the 36-inch telescope by midnight, and he would literally just shut the dome and go to bed. He wouldn't let anybody else use it. And this infuriated Barnard because Barnard would stay up dusk till dawn, and he was only allowed to use the 12-inch telescope. But even then, when he first started, he discovered 2 comets in 1888. So right off the bat, he's making discoveries. Barnard would really be the pioneer of modern astrophotography. This is really one of the main things he's known for. There was a New Year's Day eclipse in 1889, and the path of totality passed over parts of California and the Western US. And so the Lick Observatory set up an eclipse expedition. Barnard was one of the astronomers that would go to the path of totality. He would set up multiple cameras that would photograph the corona of the total eclipse. And it would turn out, I mean, this is one of the photographs here, it would turn out to be the best photographs thus far of a total solar eclipse. And I mean, he did such significant work on this that Edward Holden even suggested that the University of the Pacific confer him an honorary degree, which they did. He got a master's in science. So that was huge for Barnard. He would then sign his name as, Edward Barnard, MS. So he was, tickled pink with that. But he would continue this campaign of photography. In fact, he would take one of the lenses. It was about a 6-inch lens that he used to do the eclipse photography. And, it was set at the front of a box that would hold a photographic plate. And he essentially strapped that to the back of a 6.5-inch refractor. And that was an equatorial telescope that could guide. And he started taking photographs of the night sky. This is the first really good one that he got. It was a total of 3 hours and 7-minute exposure. And of course, he's looking through this refractor, guiding it, making sure that the image wasn't blurred at all. But he gets the first wide field images of the Milky Way and discovers that there are these large voids where you don't really see any stars. And there was a big debate, were those actual voids or was there stuff in the way? Barnard felt more about the former. He thought that they were actually large voids in the Milky Way. But he would continue astrophotography for a while. He'd make other observations. He made an interesting observation in, let's see, I think it was 1889, of an eclipse of the moon Iapetus. And at the time, it's thought that he was really the only person to have observed this until about 1970. So here we see Saturn's rings. We now know that the rings are made up of all these little bits of particles that are orbiting around Saturn. But go back to Barnard's time, we didn't know if the rings were solid or what, okay? Iapetus is an interesting moon. Here are in red, well, right at the center of all of that red mess in the middle of the image is the planet Saturn. All of that red is the orbits of about 8 or 9 of its major moons. Okay, and as you can see, they basically orbit in the plane of Saturn's rings, right around the equator. That means that they're really not going to pass through any significant shadows from the rings of Saturn. All right, Iapetus is in blue. It's kind of the oddball. Its orbit is tilted by about 15 degrees, and it orbits fairly far out. And it takes it about 80 days to go around Saturn. Now, what makes this very interesting is that because of that inclined orbit, as Saturn is going around the sun about once every 30 years, there are 2 times in that orbit, that Saturnian year, where the shadows of the rings can actually fall on that moon. Okay, so you get one opportunity about every 15 years to observe this. There was a really nice prediction for this to occur in November of 1889, and Barnard was primed to observe it. And he very politely asked, may I use the 36-inch telescope to observe this? This was one of the nights that Edward Holden had the telescope. And you can probably guess he was denied use of the telescope. Holden's like, nope, that's my night. What made him even more furious is that Saturn rose, it was shortly after midnight, Right around midnight, the dome closes, Holden goes to bed. And so he is relegated to using the 12-inch telescope. But nevertheless, Barnard, this is a kind of an interesting story. So Barnard catches Saturn in the 12-inch telescope. The seeing ends up being beautiful that night. He sees Saturn. He sees two bright moons, Tethys and I think it was Dione. And when he first caught sight of it, Iapetus was in the shadow of the globe of Saturn. Okay, and so he watched, and eventually he started seeing this little point of light gradually get brighter and brighter, and that was Iapetus coming out of the shadow of Saturn, of the globe, that is. So he made very close observations of how bright those two other moons were, and he kept an eye on Iapetus. And as Iapetus started to enter the shadow of Saturn's rings, he tried to estimate the brightness of Iapetus versus those other moons. Okay, so he's doing all of this by eye. You know, nowadays we would not do anything like this. We do it with imaging, but he gets this resulting graph, and he has a total of 80 observations. So what you see on the left is, so time goes from left to right. You see the line gets vertical. That's where Iapetus is coming out of the shadow of Saturn, of the globe. So it reaches its full brightness. And then there's a bunch of little dots, and you've got this best fit line going through there. But what you start to see is that that line starts to dip down significantly. And that's when Iapetus is starting to go into the shadow of the inner ring, what we call the C ring or the crepe ring. It's the one close into Saturn. It's really hard to make out a lot of times. It's right next to the really bright rings. But he makes very detailed observations, and he's not plotting this. He's just writing down numbers. When it's all said and done with his 80 observations, he makes this graph, and you see this very nice decrease in the brightness of Iapetus until you get to the right side and you see this abrupt drop. That's where it goes into the shadow of the A ring, okay, which is that much denser ring. So what does all this tell us? Well, at the time, it was suspected that the rings of Saturn might change in density as you go from near the planet to farther away from the planet, but nobody had any way of proving that. But Barnard had the direct observations to show that that was indeed the case here. Okay. So again, this was really only observed by Barnard until about 1970 or so. And to further that story, further the drama of the story, who doesn't love a good, juicy story about this? When he put this report together and was going to publish it, one of the other policies of Holden was that any publication from the observatory had to go across his desk first. So he insisted, and this was later revealed by Barnard publicly, that is, that Holden insisted that Barnard state in there that the 36-inch telescope was not able to acquire Saturn that night, which was total, baloney. But it was soon after that one of Barnard's fellow astronomers called Holden out on this in a newspaper and said, yeah, it was up at this altitude at this time. It was in a perfect spot for the 36-inch telescope. And it was, Holden trying to, cause a controversy. So anyway, Barnard did get, his, or I should say, Holden got his comeuppance on that one. But anyway, I know we're getting kind of long here. Let me go through just a few other fun observations. Barnard observed the moons of Jupiter, and he was intrigued by Io. Okay, so we now know Io, it looks like this. It's very volcanically active. But as he observed Io pass in front of Jupiter, on some nights, he noted that Io then, as soon as it moved in front of Jupiter, looked very squashed, okay, like it was very oblong. Then on other nights, when he observed it, it looked like it was vertically elongated, like it might be two objects stacked on top of one another. And he thought, this might actually be a binary object, and we're seeing at different points in the orbit as this object is passing in front of Jupiter. So it wasn't until that he got views through the 36-inch telescope that he realized what was happening. When Io, let me just go ahead and show you this more modern view. There's Jupiter, obviously. There's Io at the lower as the lower moon, there's Ganymede as the upper moon. And even here, you can see that Ganymede at the top looks fairly round, especially compared to Io. Io does look a little squashed, okay? In fact, it's not really squashed. The problem is it's darker at the poles. So when you place Io across one of those dark bands of Jupiter's, the poles kind of disappear against the background and you see the wider equator. And so it looks much wider. But when it passes in front of a lighter area, then it kind of does that opposite effect. So he realized, and in the 36-inch telescope, he was able to resolve the disk and he was able to see, oh, this is actually what's happening. So kind of interesting. With his photography, he continued observing the night sky, including photographing comets. And the comet photos really showed how comet tails can change on very, very short time scales. These are 3 images of Comet Morehouse. But he would continue photographing comets like this, and he would eventually realize, like in the second picture, you can see how it looks like the tail got ripped off. What he noticed is that this kind of image would occur, or he would see this activity in a comet whenever there was aurora present. And he thought, you know what, maybe the aurora, which we think is linked to the sun, maybe there's something going on with the sun that is causing both the aurora and this this tail disconnection, if you will. And he was in fact correct. When we have a big blast of material come out of the sun, it can effectively rip off the tails of comets, and also that material reaches the earth, it creates the aurora. So he was able to put 2 and 2 together, although he didn't have all the data to prove it, but he made that connection that the sun did cause these 2 phenomena. Eventually, Barnard did get regular use of the 36-inch telescope. Here's a self-portrait of him with it. And it was shortly after he got regular use that he observed Nova Auriga and was able to first spot an eruption of gas coming off of it. At the bottom on the left and right are images from Kitt Peak National Observatory in 1978 and 2016. You can see there is a definite change in the size of that. And if here's the most famous discovery of all. So observing Jupiter, he was interested in trying to find other moons around planets. 1877, we discovered the moons of Mars. He searched around Mars, could not find any other moons, so he moved to Jupiter. And while he was observing Jupiter on September 9th, 1892, he spotted a very, very faint point of light close into Jupiter, closer than Io was. And that point of light was moving, and he lost sight of it as it went behind Jupiter. But on subsequent nights, he was able to pick out that spot and eventually deduce an orbit. And he did make the announcement that he finally discovered a new moon around Jupiter. So this moon, much smaller than the other 4 Galilean moons. It's also one of the reddest objects in the solar system, and it might be a progenitor of some of Jupiter's rings. When he made his discovery, he wasn't the one that named it Amalthea. Camille Flammarion, another prominent astronomer at the time, suggested that name. And eventually so many people started calling it Amalthea that the name stuck. Barnard actually favored calling Io, Europa, and Ganymede and Callisto moons 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this would be moon 5. Okay, he was just worried about the facts here, not being super creative. But he won many prizes, including the Arago Prize and the Lalande Prize from the French Academy of Science. When you walk out of here tonight, look in our display case at the front. You'll see a pocket watch that was given to him, and has the 4 moons in Jupiter and then that 5th moon on the back of it. But what's even funnier is that once this discovery was announced, other people started saying that they had claimed to have seen this moon. And we're not talking about at big observatories. We're literally talking about somebody with a 4-inch backyard telescope looking in with their eye and seeing it, and with other people looking at it. And in some cases they actually did see something, but what they saw was a background star. So Barnard got many of these letters coming in, and he tried to very politely answer them and say, actually on this date you were seeing this background star as Jupiter was passing by. but he started getting so many of them. He's like, this is never going to end. I'm just going to stop worrying about it. So eventually they ended. But 1892, he discovered his first comet photographically, or the first comet to ever be discovered photographically. He was invited back to Nashville to give a talk shortly after his discovery of Amalthea, and he was conferred an honorary doctorate from Vanderbilt University. As far as we know, it's the only one, but we're not 100% sure on that. He asked to travel abroad for about 4 months, and he was granted that by the Board of Regents of Lick Observatory, and spent a few months out where he visited other observatories in Europe, even encountered Mark Twain in his travels. Kind of fun. All right, almost done here, just a couple more. So returning to the Milky Way, this is known as the Crocker photographic telescope. It's the original 6-inch Willard lens, but it has since been refigured, reshapen, and remounted onto a new camera body so that he can do additional photographs of the Milky Way. And he continues his photographic campaign, and it would take many years to try to complete this, though he never would finish it. But he starts seeing more and more of these dark regions. For example, this is the Pipe Nebula. Discovers a large arc of gas around Orion that we now call Barnard's Loop. In fact, he didn't discover it, but he did photograph it, and he did more extensive research on it that most people attribute, they basically gave it a name after him, even though other astronomers had done some work on it. Let me skip through just a couple things here. He eventually leaves Lick Observatory for the University of Chicago, where the Yerkes Observatory was being constructed. Part of the problem was he was trying to be very quiet about this possible job position because he was trying to get his Milky Way prints that he had already done reproduced and get the observatory to pay for them. And obviously, if you're going to just leave, they're not going to pay for it. But unfortunately, the course catalog for one of the summers came out, and it kind of let the cat out of the bag. So he didn't get all of his prints reproduced, but he was allowed to take them with him and reproduce them as long as he gave them back. So not too bad of a deal there. He would start at Yerkes in 1896, starting with the 12-inch telescope pictured there, and eventually got to use the 40-inch telescope. First night was May 20th, 1897. 9 days later, as he was leaving the dome with his assistant, about an hour after they left, the floor collapsed. So this floor, if you've ever seen the observatory, because the telescope tube is so long, that the floor actually elevates up and down by, I think it's about 30 feet or so. So there's this whole system of cabling that was suspending the floor, and one of those cables hadn't been installed correctly. So the whole floor ended up collapsing on the south side. They were really worried that something happened to the telescope, but somebody climbed up, looked at the lens. There were no cracks or anything, so everybody was like, breathing a sigh of relief. A few months later, once the floor had been repaired, they began observations again, only to find that stars had an extreme glare on them. So their worst fears, they thought, had been confirmed, that the telescope's lenses, the 40-inch lens pair, was somehow damaged. What had happened, though, was during that 3-month period of not being touched, a spider had gotten trapped inside and had built a web at the front of the lens. So somebody literally, I guess they drew straws, somebody literally had to crawl up in the tube with a feather duster, clear out the web. And then when they began observations, the views were crystal clear again. So kind of a fun story. Some of just the other side projects he had, he tried to measure parallax, which is the apparent shift of an object as we move around the sun, to try to determine distances. He wasn't able to determine any parallax for these spiral nebulae, globular clusters, or planetary nebulae, just because they were too far away, and he realized that after years of work. But now that he was away from the Lick Observatory, he no longer had the Crocker photographic telescope to continue his Milky Way photography. So he approached a wealthy heiress, Catherine Bruce, and said, here's my dilemma. I was really the pioneer of all this work, and it got cut short because I got a new job at this other observatory, and I'd really like to be able to continue it, but I need funds to create a new telescope. Bruce was a very avid supporter of astronomy, so she donated about $7,000, and the Bruce photographic telescope was set up. He did take it out to Mount Wilson in California to get his photographs of the Milky Way because the seeing at Yerkes in Chicago just wasn't that good. But he would do about 500 plates out there. And around this time, Mary Calvert, his niece, began working with him. She did a lot of correspondence, helping with computations. And this was all done at the Yerkes Observatory. And in fact, she would remain the chief computer and photographic technician for many years after Barnard's passing. Let me skip through this. In one of his, or a couple of his photographs, he noticed that some stars were exhibiting some peculiar behavior. One star looked really bright in one photo, the next photo it had dimmed down, but now there was another star next to it. And he realized that brightening and dimming of these stars, it was actually a star moving across the field of view, and that's now what we call Barnard star. Every year, you can actually take a photograph of it and see that it has moved amongst the background stars. Okay, so the second closest star system to us. So in his last years, he had exposed about 3,500 plates of the Milky Way, and he was working on this very large atlas and was desperately trying to complete it. It was really going to be his life's work there. Cataloged 349 dark nebulae, but unfortunately his health was starting to fail and was diagnosed with diabetes in 1914. May 16th, 1921, his beloved wife suffered a stroke and died 5 days later, which was just an absolute tremendous blow to Barnard. She was really his best friend. He tried to continue on his work, though. December 21st, 1922, that would be the last time he would physically be able to get up to the observatory to look through the telescope. And unfortunately, the weather did not work out, and the 40-inch lens was frosted over. His last astronomical observation would be in the morning of January 13th, 1923, and it would be from his bedroom. He would observe a morning occultation of Venus by the moon. And then February 6th, 1923, he passes away at the age of 65. He's brought back to Nashville and buried next to his wife, Rhoda, and his mother, Elizabeth, in Mount Olivet Cemetery. So he did not get to see the completion of his photographic atlas of selected regions of the Milky Way, but his niece Mary and E.B. Frost, who was the director of Yerkes, they continued on that work and brought it to completion. So this was a major resource for astronomers for a number of years. There are still first editions floating out around there. We've got a pair in the display case up front, but yeah, they're worth a huge amount now. So to sum it up, so Robert Ball basically said it, that Barnard was really the greatest observational astronomer in the world. So with that, I am 1 hour and 10 seconds into a talk, so we'll stop right there. I'm like 10 seconds over. But with that, we'll do some questions, or if anybody needs to get up and stretch, please do. Yes.
Okay, but why was Holden such a jerk? And is that fair to say that? What was his reason for denying Barnard use of the telescope?
Holden was just really a stickler for organization, for policies, and if you set rules, then you needed to follow them. It wasn't so much that he had this real big beef with Barnard. It was just he was one of these people that, you know, rules and organization, they were, you know, meant to be followed. It didn't matter, you know, what the situation was. You had to make sure that you followed everything. So
did he let that supersede
right
the
now,
cause of science?
Now, I will add to that, though, Barnard didn't, he did his own little bit to kind of fan the flames of bitterness between the two. You know, it wasn't like he would go to Holden and say, hey, I really want to use the telescope. Holden would say no, and Barnard would say, okay, and walk off. So yeah, there were a lot of exchanges between the two. So that didn't help things, but yeah, it really just boiled down to that Holden really was his main thing was making sure there was organization and rules set up, and that rules were unwavering. There's just some people like that where they may yeah, some might say jerks, but others might say yeah, just kind of draconian in their methods. Yeah, and a lot of people will say yeah, there are times where we can bend the rules if there are certain good reasons why, but yeah, that really wasn't Holden's style. So any other questions? Any questions for anybody online? Chuck, are you still awake?
I'm still here.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, yeah, we're a little bit past 9 anyway. So thank you all online. Thank you all out here for being here this evening, and hope you learned a little bit about Barnard. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to try to answer those. And again, if you haven't been up to the telescope to at least see it, I'd be happy to take anybody up there to
Set
see.
up tonight?
We can move it over to the moon tonight. Yeah. So it'll take a minute, but yeah, we can definitely do that. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all.